So there was this moment last year when I saw this article published by Mark Gurman at Bloomberg, and he was talking about a change. This was after the Vision Pro was announced, right? And he was talking about a change where Apple had decided to essentially create a division specifically for the Apple Vision Pro, which kind of flies in the face of how everything has been done in Apple since Jobs' return in 1997 after the days at Next. And I perked my ears up because my big interest is about structure and systems and how they produce different results and how they behave. And so I wanted to dive in today to talk about how Tim Cook is leaving his mark on Apple by creating this group and potentially using this structure and a new form of leadership at the company.
So I am open to entertaining any of your questions, and hope you have some good ones this morning.
What about OpenDoc?
What about OpenDoc?
Yeah.
Yeah. What about it? It's dead, right?
Huh?
It's dead, right?
Well, I don't know. I spent a lot of time working on it. And
Yeah. Well, let me say something that's sort of generic. I know some of you spent a lot of time working on stuff that we put a bullet in the head of. I apologize. I feel your pain. But Apple suffered for several years from lousy engineering management. I have to say it. And there were people that were going off in 18 different directions, doing arguably interesting things in each one of them. Good engineers, lousy management. And what happened was, you look at the farm that's been created with all these different animals going in different directions, and it doesn't add up. The total is less than the sum of the parts. And so we had to decide what are the fundamental directions we're going in, and what makes sense and what doesn't. And there were a bunch of things that didn't. And microcosmically, they might have made sense. Macrocosmically, they made no sense. And, the hardest thing is, when you think about focusing, right? You think, well, focusing is saying yes, no. Focusing is about saying no.
So when Steve Jobs came back to Apple in 1997, he structured the company functionally. I've said this many times over the last few days, that functional structure is something that is very akin to a director with a director of photography, maybe a set stylist, the makeup department, the costume department. It's someone who has a vision for something, for a product, and composes a bunch of other people with immense skill sets into something greater than the sum of their parts, right? And ever since Jobs came back from 1997, basically until, I'm going to say 2015, 2016, but basically until now, they have utilized that functional structure because it allows for centralized product decisions and it allows for efficient research and development, right? Because if you start with a product and work your way backwards to all the decisions that you have to make, it becomes very obvious to all of those functional people what they have to do to make their part of the pie great. Now, one of the distinguishing factors of a functional organization is that they align expertise and control, right? That is that level of talent. Those are the directors of photography, the person who is better than anyone else at having an eye for how to frame something. They get to be in control of the group of people who are responsible for the camera, the people who are running the SD cards, for example, right? Or the people who are maybe even doing the lighting in some cases. They oversee their little domain because they know what it takes to make a great picture, right? That expertise, the person with the most expertise, I should say, gets the most control in that situation. So what that meant for Apple is that the only person where all of those functions met, the only person who could really truly make ultimate strategic product decisions was Steve Jobs himself, right? This was based off of the problems that he faced when he was running the Mac team in his first stint at Apple, right? And so these functional organizations let you operate and innovate at these high levels. And there are 3 leadership characteristics that Apple has kind of codified that help them decide who gets to be part of that senior leadership. The first one is deep expertise. Someone who knows their stuff. They know what they're doing. They know how to do it. They've been battle tested. They are the deepest immersed in the function that they represent. The second thing, immersion in the details. Just because you've elevated yourself to a level where you have authority doesn't mean that everyone else trusts you. In fact, the people from the other functions are going to question your expertise by asking you to tell them the details. They're going to drill down on a single spreadsheet cell and have you explain to them exactly why it is the way that it is, to just test your knowledge and expertise of your realm, to make sure that you're not sleeping on the job, to make sure that you're still up to date. And I think that Apple, I don't remember if I had this exactly correct, but it's like about 3 layers below them, right? Apple's very hierarchical. If you are someone who is in charge of a function or higher up on the org chart, you need to know at least 3 layers down what is going on and what the expertise, what the more current expertise is at the leaves of the tree are. The third one, a willingness to collaboratively debate. One of the key features of Apple was that the entire company is under one profit and loss statement. They either win as a group and they lose as a group. They win as a team and they lose as a team, as they say in hockey, right? Which means you don't pin it to any one individual person in terms of the profit and loss of the company, which is very unusual. Most divisional companies, most other tech companies are structured in a way where that's not the case. What that requires is that it requires that these people who are experts of their own domain, the people who are highest up in the silo that they represent, they have to be willing to talk with other people across different realms and actually also within their realm to make sure that they are debating and getting the best ideas because they're all pushing towards the same goal, which is Apple's success, not their own. So, deep expertise, immersion in the details, and a willingness to collaboratively debate. All 3 of those things align expertise with control. The higher up you go, the closer you get to the more you get to make more important decisions. And that's because you gain this deep expertise, you gain an immersion in the details, and you gain the ability to collaboratively debate as you move up the org chart. But there's a problem with functional organizations, and that is that the information flows upward, right? The reason that these people who are experts sit at the top of other experts below them is because they get lots of information that flows up to them. All of the best ideas bubble up to the top of the company because they've got the smartest people working underneath them, and they just happen to be able to collect all of that knowledge and have a better model of the function that they perform. There's a problem with that, though. When expertise and knowledge flows upward, that also means that you have to have decisions made at high levels as well. Strategic decisions can only be made at high levels and not at lower levels because the people far down on the org chart have no idea what the strategic decisions are. They can make their guesses, but they're not looped into the conversation because they don't have to be. This is one of the ways that Apple stays secret, actually, is by keeping that precious. So what happens is that information flows up and decisions flow down, right? But that the nexus point of those 2 things are these senior leaders. They have to take all of the information and make the best decisions that they can to make the best products they can to keep Apple successful. There's an issue with that, right? Which is that if every decision flows up to the top, the more you grow, the more you scale, the harder it is to keep things decongested, the harder it is to cover every single decision that you have to make.
The debating thing is interesting because I do think one of the things someone's asked me what the problem is, and I'm like, they're surrounded by people who get They pay, they own, and they don't have anyone disagreeing with them. There's no disagreement, there's no
That's right.
debate. Everyone is in violent agreement together, and then they feel victimized as a group.
Yes.
You know.
Where there was always debate with him. There was
I'd imagine.
always debate. I know there was a folklore that you didn't debate him. That's not true. In fact, if you didn't debate him, he would kind of mow you down. And he did not work well with those kind of folks that would not feel comfortable in debating and pushing back, and it was a very different environment for me. Because I came out of an environment that was more hierarchical in nature, and you sort of, each person agreed with the higher level person before you entered a room, and there was no debate and no discussion. And
What was your greatest debate with him over?
Probably the way the initial iPhone was sold.
What was your side?
I was for putting it in the subsidy model, and he was for the rev share. And his way was more creative and more different. My way would have scaled faster. At least I felt strongly, and so we were in quite a discussion about this for a while. It was a multi-year discussion.
So the problem with a functional organization is that it doesn't scale well. Decisions get congested at the very top of the organization, and that stagnates everything because you've gummed up the works, essentially, right? That is why companies switch to divisional organizations, because then you disperse that decision-making capability across the company rather than centering it at the top where Steve Jobs sat. But if there's anyone that's good at scaling things, it's Tim Cook, right? Now, for a lot of it, and in a lot of interviews, Tim Cook has said that they run Apple the same way that Steve Jobs kind of set out, which is in this functional organization. This way that people study Apple, right, in order to understand how they can run a functional organization at the scale that they do. But again, if there's anyone that can scale it, it's Tim Cook. And if there's anything Tim Cook can do, it is scale. I'm getting at something here, which is that story that I read in that summer that I told you about. Let's go back to that right now. Now, I was there. Vision Pro had been announced about a month earlier, and I think that the thing that stood out to me about the article was that there was a new group name for the group that developed the Apple Vision Pro. So before this, it was called the Technology Development Group, which was created in 2015 with internal to Apple, and it was run by Mike Rockwell. This isn't really anything special. This is what this is what Steve Jobs did for a lot of the products. This is what Tim Cook did for the Apple Watch. You kind of create this cross-functional collaborative group to put the product together, version 1, and secretively get it out. So in this regard, it's not a lot that's new. But there's something key about the Vision Group, and that's that Tim Cook has not had a lot of oversight over it. He is not deeply involved in the product decisions because he's not a product guy. This was everyone's critique of him when he when he became Apple's CEO, right? And so what that meant is that this group sort of picked from the best of the best at the company, put them all together in a team, and they built Apple Vision Pro. Great, awesome. They announced Apple Vision Pro in June of 2023, and then a month later, they changed the name of the group from the Technology Development Group to Vision Products Group. That's the thing that caught my eye. It's a pretty small change, right? Naming something from one to the other isn't a foundational change at a company, but it was emblematic of one, right? The reason is that you don't name a group something new, Vision Products Group, if it isn't gonna stick around. And that meant that there's gonna be a division at Apple that was designed to run Apple Vision Pro and operate Apple Vision Pro. This is not how things have been done in the past at Apple. once the iPhone was released, it became a product of the company, and everyone kind of moved their resources and their innovations. They all flowed into Steve Jobs, and he made decisions about the product, and then it went out, right? This is different. The Vision Products Group is going to continue iterating on Apple Vision Pro, but have a duplicated set of capabilities and functions that exist within Apple at large, within their own division. This, again, I think is going to be Tim Cook's biggest mark on Apple when he leaves. The fact that he is creating divisions within Apple that are responsible for products is a huge change from the way that Steve Jobs organized the company in the past. And it represents Tim Cook's mindset that you need to do different things in order to scale the company at the pace it has scaled over the past 10, 15 years. So with the new divisional, I guess, plug-in module entities within Apple, there's a change to the leadership model that needs to happen, right? Before, experts led experts. There were 3 characteristics that you needed to be a leader at Apple, a senior leader: deep expertise, immersion in the details, and a willingness to collaboratively debate. All 3 of those things were in service of putting the best of the best in their function at the top of the company. What this does is it adds another dimension to that. It actually adds 2 dimensions. Well, no, it does actually add another dimension to that. Expertise is still important, but the other dimension that it adds is immersion in the details. Because once you start having to keep track of an increasing number of details, well, you need to start making decisions about what you're paying attention to, right? So there is a new model that actually has been codified, and I'm going to tell it to you in a second here. And this new model was developed in order to maintain cross-functional collaboration within the company while allowing the company to scale and not stagnate. Okay? Let me explain. Once Apple scales, you have to have a higher number of leaders, bottom line, right? The bigger you are, the more people you're leading, the more leaders you need. Simple. The problem is that if you scale the number of leaders proportionally to the number of people that Apple has hired, you would have too many leaders within the company. This is kind of a funny thing to say, right? To say that maybe a company has too many leaders, because a lot of companies have a vacuum of leaders. But here's why that's important. In a functional company, if you have leaders, they're in charge of a function. And then if you have 100 functions, there's no way that you're going to get 100 leaders to effectively collaborate. You need to limit that preciously. So the only way to increase the complexity, increase the details for those leaders, is to let them delegate as well, the same way that Tim Cook delegated Apple Vision Pro. That is the key feature. You allow leaders to delegate. This is not the norm for Apple. It's the norm in almost every other company. It's not the norm at Apple. And so they've codified this into what they call the discretionary leadership model. And it has 4 quadrants, and I'd love to get into them.
Really, it's leading up to the actual thesis of this talk, which is this. It's this idea I have. It's an answer to my question of why the output often doesn't equal the talent that produced it. And it's this, that the quality of any collaborative creative endeavor tends to approach the level of taste of whoever is in charge. And in the parlance of this framework of saying, let's just pretend that movie making applies to any such endeavor at all, we could define in charge as whoever has final cut. Whether you're working on a website, whether you're working at a consumer electronics company to make a new cell phone, whether you're making a Mac app, an iPhone app, any sort of creative thing, there's somebody who says this is good enough. And whatever their level of taste is, that's what the quality of the product tends to approach. And I worry that this whole thing sounds terribly, terribly obvious, but to me the insight, the thing that kind of clicked the light on my head and made sense of it all, was that it works in both directions. And what you really want is you want somebody leading the project whose taste is up here, and you've got talent that is here, and through the course of making the thing, the people, the goal and the leadership, it gets closer and closer to this taste. But it does work in the other direction too, where if whoever has the final authority. Even if they're uninvolved day to day, they're just somebody who at the very end, you run it through and they're like, now you gotta add some buttons, you gotta put a happy ending, you gotta put a voiceover on it. If their taste is down here, it doesn't matter how good the talent is. It's inevitably going to lead the output to kind of reach that lower level of quality.
As promised. This line represents the axis that Steve Jobs centered when he came back to Apple and made it a functional organization. We're going to call this expertise. You can either have low expertise or high expertise. The higher you were up on this continuum, the more decisions you were able to make at the company. Tim Cook, all he did was add another axis. This one I'm going to call the details axis. This one, you can either have low involvement in the details or high involvement in the details. Now, this axis was implicit before in Jobs' company, but all the time managers were in this high involvement area. So managers before spent all their time here. These were the people who had high involvement, high expertise, knew the details, could dig deep, and had the ability to compromise. And that is how Apple has made really innovative products in the past. Now, you can occupy a few more quadrants in Tim Cook's Apple. Here, with high details, high expertise, these are the things that you own, right? But what if you have high details and low expertise? Now, first of all, why would this happen? In old-fashioned Apple, this wouldn't ever happen no matter what, because you'd always be high details, high expertise. But now the company is broad enough and there's so few managers that have to manage such a diverse group of talent that sometimes you have to learn. So you are slowly, as a leader at Apple, becoming experts in more than your core expertise. What about when you're high in expertise, but low involvement in the details? Well, there, you have to spend your time teaching. We'll just say teach. Okay? This is when you need to do a little bit of delegation, but ultimately it's still in your core expertise. It falls in this spectrum where Steve Jobs' Apple spent most of their time, which is in the high expertise area. And so that leaves one spot left, which is delegate. This is the one that is uncharted territory for Apple under Steve Jobs and is the key feature of Tim Cook's Apple that will differentiate it from Steve Jobs' Apple going forward. Now, I want to fill these in a little bit more, right? When you own something, that's your core expertise. Again, that's what Apple had at the very beginning. When you learn something, you have a high involvement in the details still, right? You're still responsible for, say, learning how news publications work, but you want to learn quickly so you can make the best product possible. As you learn, your product gets better. Teaching, you delegate the ownership a little bit. You say, oh, well, I know exactly what I'm going to do here, and this heavily involves feedback. So your team still works on these projects without you, for the most part, but you give critical feedback that lets them become better experts. What about general management? Slip of the tongue there. General management falls under delegation. This is the same thing as general managers. You have low expertise and low involvement. And that's exactly why Jobs fired all these people at the very beginning when he came back, is because these people had no idea what they were doing. They did not know what they were doing. They didn't know how to do it. But it's required now because Apple is a complex business and you cannot scale everything. This is the thing that lets you have some of the smarts delegated across the company. Not everything has to be centralized. This lets you decentralize the company. This forces you to centralize everything. And so by adding this axis, you allow different models of leadership within a company and therefore create different products. Now, I want to point something out. One example of a manager at Apple might spend 40% of their time here, whereas before they were spending 100% of their time. They might spend 30% of their time here. So for the most part, they are spending most of their time highly involved in the details. They might spend 15% of the time here and 15% of the time here. So much more of the time is spent owning the details and knowing what you're doing than delegating out to other people. And that little switch compared to other companies may be enough to maintain Apple's level of quality, their level of innovation, the spirit that Steve Jobs imbued when he came back. So here are the implications. Here's the bottom line. The big change, again, is that it lets senior managers delegate. Therefore, some projects within the company are going to act as divisional groups, just like in a traditional organization. This is the perfect example of this is the Vision Products Group, right? Tim Cook at the top, not a product guy, chooses someone to be the product guy, and he delegates that. Senior leaders still compose these groups. They decide who gets to be a part of them. They get to delegate those responsibilities completely away and not care too much about the details, because what they do is they set key performance indicators and they give them not a profit and loss statement, but they set goals and make sure that they're being achieved. These projects usually are less valuable to Apple at the time of their creation. Apple Vision Pro is not the greatest example of this, but one example that I've seen is iMovie, Final Cut Pro, GarageBand, these things that used to be very core to Apple's business, but now have fallen by the wayside as the iPhone has gained popularity, as the services industry has become more important to them, as App Store revenue has become more important to them. They have fallen into the delegation category. I think my question is, the things that get delegated, will they end up being second-class citizens in the organization? Or will they serve as an opportunity to grow into something bigger and better than they could have before, because it just so happened that everything being centralized had gummed up the works enough that they weren't getting attention in the first place? My second question is whether or not this will allow the deep expertise to continue existing at Apple that allows them to continue innovating. I think it will, because the honest truth is that Apple has a deep bench to draw from. They've got a lot of really smart people that work at that company. And so pulling a few of them to the side to work on these 15% of projects that are delegated, or this 15% of time that ends up being delegated, well, in my mind, it's a sacrifice worth making, and at least an experiment worth doing. There's this other thing, as we close here, that really inspired me when I was doing my research. And with Steve Jobs' idea that the processes and the way that companies operate should be treated as in a scientific manner. That there's a theory behind them, and that you can try it out and test it and see if it works. And so whether or not this axis being added is a good idea will be left to how it's done. And all we can hope for is that Apple will learn from it.
In most companies, if you're new and you ask, why is it done this way? The answer is because that's the way we do it here, or because that's the way it's always been done. And in my opinion, the largest contribution of much of this quality thinking is to approach these ways of doing things, these processes, scientifically, where there is a theory behind why we do them. There is a description of what we do, and most importantly, there is an opportunity to always question what we do. And this is a radically different approach to business processes than the traditional one, because it's always done this way. And that single shift is everything, in my opinion, because it in that shift is a tremendous optimistic point of view about the people that work in a company. It says these people are very smart. They're not pawns. They're very smart. And if given the opportunity to change and improve, they will. They will improve the processes if there's a mechanism for it. And that optimistic humanism I find very appealing. And I think we have countless examples that it works.